Hello, my name is Ginger Dunham of Greenhouse Preschool in Bothell. I'm going to be reading one of my students' weekly favorites and one of my personal favorites, a biography of Albert Einstein called On a Beam of Light. Over 100 years ago, as the stars swirled in the sky, as the earth circled the sun, as the March winds blew through a little town by a river, a baby boy was born. His parents named him Albert. Albert turned 1 year old, and he didn't say a word. Albert turned 2, and he didn't say a word. Albert turned 3, and he hardly said any words at all. He just looked around with his big eyes and wondered, looked and wondered, looked and wondered. His parents worried a little. Albert was so different. Was there something wrong? But he was their baby. They loved him no matter what. So different, but so dear. One day, when Albert was sick in bed, his father brought him a compass, a small round case with a magnetic needle inside. No matter which way Albert turned the compass, the magnetic needle always swung around to point north, as if held by an invisible hand. Albert was so amazed his whole body trembled. Suddenly, he knew that there were mysteries in the world, hidden and silent, unknown and unseen, and he wanted more than anything to understand those mysteries. Albert started asking questions. Questions at home, questions at school, so many questions that some of his teachers told him, "You are a disruption to class." They said he would never amount to anything unless he learned to behave like all the other students. But Albert did not want to be like the other students. He wanted to discover the hidden mysteries of the world. One day, as Albert was zipping through the countryside on his bicycle, he looked up at the beams of sunlight coming from the sun to the earth, and he wondered, what would it be like to ride one of those beams of light? And right then and there, in his imagination, Albert was no longer on his bicycle, no longer on the country road, but he was racing through space on a beam of light. And it was the biggest, most exciting thought Albert had ever had, and it filled his mind with questions. Albert began to read and study. He read about light and sound, and heat and magnetism, and about gravity, the invisible force that pulls us down to our planet and keeps the moon orbiting our Earth and keeps all of the planets orbiting the sun. And he read about numbers. Albert loved numbers. Math was like a secret language for figuring everything out. But all that reading and math still didn't answer all of Albert's questions, so he kept on reading and wondering and learning. When Albert finally graduated from college, he wanted to get a job teaching the subjects he loved, all the things he had read about and studied all those years. But Albert couldn't find a job as a teacher, so he got a different job. It was a simple, quiet job in a government office, an office where he worked with other people's ideas and inventions. He did his work very well and very quickly, so quickly that he had lots of extra time to think and wonder. Albert watched a lump of sugar dissolve and disappear into his hot tea. How could this happen? He wondered. He watched the smoke from his pipe swirl and then disappear into the air. How can one thing disappear into another? He wondered. Then he began to figure it out. He thought about the idea that everything is made of teeny tiny moving bits of stuff, far too tiny to see, little bits called atoms. Some people didn't believe that atoms existed, but Albert's figuring helped prove that everything in the world is made of atoms, even sugar and tea and smoke and air, even Albert and you and me, even this book is made of atoms. Then Albert thought about movement. He realized that everything is always moving, moving through space, moving through time, even when we are sleeping. Our planet is still moving us around the sun, and our lives are still traveling into the future. Albert thought about time and space the way no one had ever thought about them before. Albert wrote down his new ideas, put them in envelopes, and sent them out to science magazines. The magazines printed everything Albert sent. He hoped that scientists and professors would be interested in his ideas, and they were, very interested indeed. The professors at universities invited Albert to come and work with them and teach with them. For the first time in his life, people started to say, "Albert is a genius!" Now, Albert could spend all his days doing what he loved, imagining, wondering, figuring, and thinking. Albert thought about very, very big things, like the size and shape of the entire universe. And he thought about very, very small things, like what goes on inside the tiny atoms that everything is made of. And he thought about mysterious invisible forces, like magnets and gravity and sound. And he discovered whole new ways to understand how all these things work. Everywhere Albert went, he would think and think. One of Albert's favorite thinking places was in his little sailboat. He loved to let his mind wander as the wind blew him across the water. Sometimes, when Albert was having a tough time with a really tricky problem, he would put it aside and take a break and go play his violin. Music made Albert very happy. He said it helped him think better. Albert even chose his clothing for thinking. His favorite clothing was comfy, old, saggy-baggy sweaters and pants, and shoes with no socks. He said that now that he was a grown-up, nobody could tell him to put on his socks anymore. He says, "My feet are happier without socks." In the town where he lived, Albert became known for wandering around deep in thought, sometimes eating an ice cream cone. Always recognizable with his long, wild hair, which was by then quite white. Everywhere Albert went, he tried to figure out the secrets of the universe, and he never forgot about the beam of light that he had ridden so long ago in his imagination. Albert figured out that no person, no thing, could ever zoom through space as fast as a beam of light. And he figured that if he could travel near the speed of light, crazy things would happen. Only minutes of time would pass for Albert, while years and years would go by for the rest of us. This idea was so amazing people didn't believe it at first, but scientists and mathematicians today have proven that it's true. Albert thought and figured until the very last minute of the very last day of his life. He asked questions never asked before, and found answers never found before, and dreamed up ideas never dreamt before. Albert's ideas helped build spaceships and satellites that travel to the moon and beyond. His thinking helped us understand our universe as nobody ever had before. But still, Albert left us with many big questions, questions that scientists are still working on today. Questions that maybe someday you may answer by wondering, thinking, and imagining. The end. Thank you so much for listening.